Hello, everybody. It is Saturday night at 10 o'clock. This is the Aries Studio channel, and this is Starfleet Tactical on the Aries Studio channel. I am Chris Weave, as always. I am solo tonight. I don't even have Lissa backstopping me. She's off doing some stuff with her family, and so I'm here all by myself. I am not having any audio problems because I finally figured out what was going on, and user error. Yeah, it was all user error. So once I wasn't trying to troubleshoot it under time pressure, and I could sort of sit back and think about it, and without like, I have to fix this now, I have to fix this now, I have to fix this now, I sort of went, well, okay, it's doing X, and that means this, and oh yeah, I bet that's it. And it was. So it was a settings issue on my part, not with the default settings. It was with the turning off other noise sources. I accidentally turned off StreamYard. Okay, so in any event, I've been gone for a couple of weeks. That's because I was down in Alabama, in Montgomery, Alabama, for the day job. I was down there for 10 days, and one of the features of being down there for 10 days was that I was there over the weekend. Didn't have any work to do on the weekend, so I drove to Mobile, Alabama, where I met Wright Sublette and his friend Mike, if I remember correctly. I should have looked that up. Please, Wright, let me know if I got that right. In any event, we did a tour of the battleship Alabama. It was pretty nifty. In fact, that's a battleship worth going to, because not only do you get the Alabama, and not only do you get a submarine, and honestly, at most places where you go to have ships, there's more than one there. And, you know, you go to Massachusetts and you get to see a couple of PT boats, and you get to see a destroyer, and you get to see a submarine, et cetera, et cetera. So why should you go to the Alabama when you could just go to Fall River, Massachusetts, and see all that? And you've got the USS Salem that's up in Quincy, Massachusetts, so you can see a Des Moines class cruiser up there. I mean, there's a lot of stuff there. So why go to Alabama? The answer is at Alabama, they have an A-12 there, because it's also an aviation museum. So there's some cool stuff there that we get to see. And so I like the fact that I got to see an A-12, and it's close enough that you can touch. And they had an engine outside the aircraft. And so you could see just exactly how big that engine on that airplane is. The engine was literally bigger than the airplane. It was next to a Scorpion, like an F-89 or something like that. And the SR-71 engine is literally bigger than that airplane was. So, let's see what else is going on. So in any event, I got back, and I'm going to be solo tonight, because I don't even have Alyssa here tonight, let alone Pat. Pat's wife got home, having been traveling for a while, so she just got back like either last night or today. So everybody else is off doing family stuff. So let me go ahead and throw up the slide deck. We're going to talk about assumptions in science fiction. Now, this is a topic that I've been wanting to talk about for a while. And I haven't, because I had a list of things, but I didn't have a framework. And so I tried to actually sort of put together sort of a coherent listing of things that I can do. Or, you know, a coherent framework in which to analyze something. I don't want to just dump stuff out. And so I'm kind of still at the dumping stuff out stage. This is not the end all be all of this, but I've decided that what I really needed to do was to just go ahead and do it and start that ball rolling. Because first of all, as I think about it, and as I do it, and as I rewatch it later, the framework, I think, will become a little bit clearer. It'll also give you guys an opportunity to give me some feedback on it. And so I might as well just go ahead and put the marker down on the table and start doing that. So that's the plan, but that's a plan that might actually end up finishing a little bit early. So if you've got questions, please ask the questions. If you've got questions about anything that Chris Carlson and I talked about, please ask those questions. There's lots of opportunity to discuss things tonight, even though I'm solo. So please ask lots of questions. All right. So this is the usual schedule. And so this is all based upon my availability. And it looks like the 29th of October and the 4th of November are going to be no's. But other than that, I'm pretty much available through mid-December. 4th of November, I will be 29th. First of all, those are 2 weeks right in a row, and I'll be on a travel. I'll be on a business trip at that point. So those are the bookends of that business trip. So I'm not expecting to be able to do it then. But the rest of the time I should be available. So, okay. So this slide looks familiar to some of you who've been on this show for a while, because this is a slide that I use in a bunch of presentations, and I've pulled a bunch of slides from that. And what I'm going to do is basically go through some. I'm going to start off by going through some slides that I've been through. Well, I'm going to, throughout the presentation, I'm going to redo some slides that I've done previously, but I'm going to try to put a little bit different spin on it and then expand upon that later. So I reserve the right to come back and do this yet again at some point once I sort of pulled it all together. But in the meantime, some of this is going to look familiar to those who have been on for a while. I'm totally, I've never turned away from redoing stuff like that for a couple of reasons. One of which is, okay, so I did it 75 shows ago. That was a long time ago, right? I may have done it a couple of years ago. And so it's good to put the hood up again and sort of show it again. And I also don't make the assumption that anybody who is seeing this particular episode has necessarily watched every previous episode. Although I would be forced to ask the question of why haven't you watched every previous episode, but I'm not really going to make that assumption. So in any event, bottom line up front, I've often made the argument that in the real world, ships operate within the context of the real world. That's not really that profound, but yet it kind of is. And by that, I mean, ships are products of their environment. Navies are product of their environment. Fleets are products of their environment. They are designed within a particular context, within a given set of assumptions. Those assumptions are derived by the real world. Those assumptions are derived by physics and engineering, but also things like budget, resources, the level of the threat, those things like that. Science fiction ships are frequently not products of their environment, of that contextualized set of assumptions. Instead, frequently science fiction ships are just taking a terrestrial example, like a World War II Navy, and running it through the science fiction converter, sometimes without even bothering to really turn it on, and just slapping the words "in space" on the end. And that can be entertaining, but as a naval analyst, I find that unsatisfying because I see the places where it's like, yeah, except that assumption just isn't true in this environment. That assumes X is true, and it's not true there. And so this is all part of an effort to try to define all that stuff, figure out what those assumptions are, and sort of define the types of assumptions, et cetera, in the hopes of making anybody who's watching this either an educated consumer of science fiction and or maybe an educated producer of science fiction. I'd love it if authors are watching this and sort of seeing how to make their stuff be more realistic, hold together better. That's kind of my goal in all this. Most science fiction works, like I said, just sort of file the serial numbers off, and frequently they come from a wide variety of time periods. They don't all necessarily come from the same time period. And so you see that in the game Starfire in particular. where you've got light cruisers and scout cruisers and heavy cruisers and exploration cruisers and this cruiser and that cruiser and this cruiser and the other cruiser. You might have heavy destroyers and light destroyers and escort destroyers and this and that. And, realistically, those are all products of a particular time period. And in some cases, it's not even what you think it is. For instance, light cruiser in particular is a type of cruiser that meant one thing, kind of died out for about 2 decades, and then came back with a formal definition in the London Naval Treaty of what a light cruiser was that had no relationship to what a light cruiser was 2 decades earlier. So that's the context of that. That's the assumptions. And the Washington and London naval treaties in particular caused the navies of the world to come up with some interesting ship designs that were designed specifically to meet treaty commitments, that you would never have come up with those ship designs if you had been just sort of sitting down and saying, what type of ship do I need? Take the engineering, the physics of the situation and the engineering of the situation, and see, what I thought combat was going to look like, and sort of do the analysis to figure out what should that ship look like. You don't necessarily end up with, for instance, an 8-inch gun to heavy cruiser. The reason why heavy cruisers had 8-inch guns is because the London Naval Treaty limited, first the Washington Naval Treaty limited cruisers to 8-inch guns, and then the London Naval Treaty defined heavy cruisers as having guns between 6 and 8 inches, and light cruisers having 6 inches or below. So it was like 6.1 for the heavy cruisers or something like that. And so it did not refer to the size of the cruiser. It referred to the armament of the cruiser. A light cruiser and a heavy cruiser could be built on the same hull. They just had different weapons on board. Frequently were built on related hulls, because why redo all the engineering when you've got a perfectly seaworthy hull that you can use? So the answers on what your Navy looks like in a science fiction setting are highly dependent upon your assumptions. And I'm going to try to go through some of them. Like I said, it's not quite gelling in the way that I would like to. Like, for instance, I don't spend nearly as much time talking about the effects of borders, but I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But borders in your jump drive, et cetera, make an important, it's important how those things interact with each other. So a couple of questions here I'll go ahead and pull out. First of all, Stephen Ross asks a question: will there also be examples of SF ships and fleets that are products of their environment? I've got one that I'm going to talk a little bit about, where somebody clearly ran something through the science fiction converter, except he left it turned on when he did it. He filed the serial numbers off, but came up with something that actually worked really, really well. There are science fiction ships and fleets that are products of their environment. There are, and I expect to, like I said, to come back to this topic. And at some point, I didn't have the time to sort of do the research I wanted to sort of come up with a definitive list of that, but I want to. One Horse Shay has a couple of questions here, or comments, like defining a Constitution class as a heavy cruiser, Saladin class as a destroyer. Yeah, that's exactly it. In fact, in Star Trek, and this has sort of been a recurring theme on the show, why call that a heavy cruiser? Why call it a destroyer? A destroyer was a job description that you ended up with a ship that looked like a particular type of ship because it was designed to do the mission of a destroyer, which started out as a torpedo boat destroyer, which also was a torpedo boat itself, and then turned into ASW destroyers and things like that, right? It had a surface and a subsurface role. But those ships were designed to do particular things for a particular amount of money, right? It's important to remember that, the comment's been made. Jellicoe made this comment. Other people have made the comment that a battleship is perfectly capable of dealing with torpedo boats. It just doesn't want to, because it's busy trying to fight other battleships. So what if you just bought an extra battleship and sent, yeah, that actually doesn't work. You're better off having stuff that you can spread out. But a lot of the reason why different ships make sense is because it's how many you can buy for a given unit of money, right? I can buy more destroyers. Destroyers are, relatively speaking, ton for ton, I believe, cheaper than capital ships. They're certainly easier to build, and they take smaller dockyard space and stuff like that. So they're a good use of your resources if that's what you need. Even if you could put that on a bigger hull, you probably wouldn't want to in World War II terms or World War I terms. In fact, every admiral that I've ever seen comment on it has said that in those conflicts said that they wanted more destroyers. Jellicoe was always saying that he wanted more destroyers. He wanted more light ships. He had plenty of capital ships. He wanted more light ships. Second thing that One Horse Shay said was, then say hello to the 12-inch Alaska class large cruiser. Yeah, the Alaska class is particularly interesting. Now, I will admit, I don't know the full story behind this. I need to pull the thread on it. But what I do believe to be the case, it goes something like this. U.S. intelligence, U.S. naval intelligence, got wind that the Japanese were building a new type of cruiser. And they thought it was going to be, let's call it a super cruiser, right? It was going to be what similar to what the Alaska ended up being. So they see these indications, what they interpret as indications, the Japanese are going to build a super cruiser. Well, and so they go, we got to have something that can fight this thing. So they design the Alaska class. And so the Japanese then hear about the Alaska class. Now, it turns out that U.S. naval intelligence was just plain wrong about what the Japanese were going to do. They were planning on building something that looked pretty much like a standard cruiser. But then the Japanese found out about these Alaska class cruisers, and they said, we got to build something that can deal with that. And so they then redesigned their ships to be the super cruiser. Now, their ships never ended up in the water. There were, yep, right. Sublet says Mogami class. I'm looking at you. It is indeed the Mogami. But the comment on all of this is that the interesting part of all of this is that multiple navies started talking about super cruisers. Once the Washington Naval Treaty was gone by the wayside, and people are just like opening up the creative vaults and starting to do all the stuff that they weren't doing because they were trying to fit within the treaty limitations, all the post-treaty stuff started coming out. You really only saw the Alaska class post-treaty cruiser, and you saw the Yamato class post-treaty battleship, and the Iowas. The Iowas fit in this category too. I think the South Dakotas are close enough to the treaty. There's some that were just like a little bit over. The influence of the treaty was very substantial, and as a result, I don't necessarily count them as being post-treaty designs. I look at post-treaty designs in this case as meaning instances where nobody was thinking about the treaty when pen hit the paper and they started designing. They just were, the treaty wasn't a factor. They're not even pretending that's not where they were when they started. And that fits the only a handful of ships. Stephen Ross made the comment that CJ Cherry had the best line regarding borders. The border is where the fleet sits at the moment. That really is kind of true. Although in her universe, there is geography. You really do kind of want to go from point A to point B, although you can sort of sometimes skip over that. I'll get to that a little bit later. CJ Cherry is actually an example of a Navy that is sort of sui generis. It's built according to the assumptions of her universe. There's some difficulty in figuring out the exact technical parameters of her ships because of her limited third-person viewpoint. It can be very frustrating for somebody who's trying to sort of scope it out like that. But it is the case that her ships are not just historical Navy vessels with serial number scroll off. They are most definitely not that. Okay, let's see. One Horse Shay said Drakenefeld did a great video on the history of the Alaska. I have watched that video. It is a great video. I haven't watched it recently. I need to go back and take another look at that. Okay, so next slide. Take something to drink. Here is what I'm going to go over tonight. I already gave you the bottom line up front. I'm going to talk about types of assumptions, a very, very, very incomplete list. I'm going to throw up the Building the Navy slide And then I'm going to talk about the 3 H's. Now, you already saw the bottom line up front slide before. I've used it a couple of times on the show. Same with the building a Navy slide, same with the 3 H's. Then I'm going to talk about sort of some thoughts on doing it right and wrong. The main difference when I go through these slides that you've seen before is I'm really going to try to spend more time talking about the assumptions that are sort of built behind it. And so the voiceover is not going to quite be the same as what you've heard before. Okay, so types of assumptions. A lot of them fit in the idea of technological assumptions. So, how good are your sensors? What can your sensors see? What can your sensors see in the particular environment that you're in? As you'll see on the next slide, the environment's actually really, really important. Do your sensors operate in that environment in a way analogous to surface Navy sensors, right? Surface Navy uses radar, and it uses sonar, and it uses electronic eavesdropping, electronic support measures, right? You can detect radio waves. To a lesser degree, it uses infrared. That's pretty much it. And so those sensors, sonar doesn't work in space. The other ones do. But do they work the same way? Do they have the same field of view? Can they see the same distance? Does their background environment look the same? How does the various phenomenologies propagate? It's one of the things about sonar in particular. Sonar is weird. Sound does not move in straight lines, but it is predictable if you've got the environmental information necessary to do the calculations. Okay, what about weapons? How do your weapons work? How far can your weapons shoot, right? One of the defining differences between the age of sail and, say, the age of World War I is that age of sail vessels not only moved very slowly, but didn't shoot very far, right? If you're shooting 300 yards, you're doing great in the age of sail. By the time World War II rolls around, you could shoot 30,000 yards if you wanted to. You probably didn't do that much often, but you probably shot 3,000. You shot 3,000 more than you did 300. So how those weapons work, what their range is, et cetera, sort of will define the structure of your fleet. How's your communications work? Can you talk? Can you have command and control? You have to have communications to have command and control. And what sort of command and control do you have? What's your propulsion look like? And this is especially important when you start getting into FTL drives. Do you have a jump drive? Do you slog through space? How does your jump drive work? Where does it come into, right? If you have to jump in around the order of the orbit of, say, Neptune, and then sort of slog your way into the inner system over the course of 3 weeks, that's a much, much different situation than I can jump into Earth orbit. That's going to come up as later on. What's your defense look like? Can I shrug off the enemy's weapons, or is it one hit, one kill? So if you're taking, as a general rule, World War II capital ship combat or World War I capital ship combat, you've got armor. You can take hits. You may not be able to take very many, but you can take hits. Whereas nowadays, you get hit by an anti-ship missile, you're probably dead in the water. Combat looks a lot different now than it did then. So if you're trying to come up with an analogy for how you want space combat to look, does it look like now or does it look like then? So you've also got economic issues. And this is a very slim list, but what's your resource base look like? How much can you afford to pay? What's your strategy look like? What are you trying to accomplish? If the strategy of a historical time period doesn't match the strategy of the science fiction time period, then it doesn't fit, right? Like, it doesn't make sense to have small polities have huge navies. And now, some people have made that work. David Weber in particular has made that work, but you'll notice David spent an awful lot of time making that work, right? He had an awful lot of explanation as to why Manticore had such a large navy. Part of it was they were really, really rich, and part of it was they knew the whirlwind was coming, and so they were willing to prep for it. They had a level of foresight and I don't want to say stick-to-itiveness because I hate that as a word. They had a level of foresight and determination and focus that is almost unique, would be unique in the world, because that's not really how that works in the real world as a general rule. And we're going to get back to the concept of borders towards the end in particular. But borders are important. Like, are there borders? Does your jump drive, does your FTL drive create borders or not? And there's an interplay there between like sensors and your propulsion, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, that's one of the things about Star Trek is they do have meaningful borders in that they've got sensors that operate over extremely long ranges, and they've got a propulsion system. Warp drive is such that you have to go to get from point A to point C, you have to go through all the points in between. And so you can be detected when you're crossing a border. Now, they're also kind of wishy-washy about stuff because not everybody in that volume of space is going to be a Federation member. And so there's areas where there's borders, but I kind of look at it and go like, okay, so the Romulans don't cross a neutral zone, but not everybody that the Romulans might be going to see are members of the Federation. So why aren't the Romulans allowed to cross a neutral zone if they're going to see, a particular race that isn't part of the Federation? What's going on there? Star Trek's kind of inconsistent about that. So here's a slide you've seen before. It's about building a navy. The way this slide works, and there's a presentation that I do on this. I'm trying to remember. I think I've even actually done it on the show, but there's a presentation that goes along with it. I've done it with David Weber multiple times, and specifically in the context of the Honorverse. Goes from left to right, and basically you answer the questions implicit in the box. So you've got to make some strategic assumptions here, and they drive everything else going down. But there's also other assumptions that are built into that. Questions and assumptions are basically the same thing, right? So you've got some strategic assumptions about what your security environment looks like and what your fiscal environment looks like. Do you live in a bad neighborhood, and do you have the money to deal with it, right? And because you can't move your planet, well, there are science fiction books where you do move your planet, but as a general rule, you can't move your planet. You hopefully those things match. Then you have to figure out what your strategic goals are, how you're going to deal with this situation. And then once you've done your strategic goals, you start defining the rest of your fleet. Like, what do you think the fleet missions are going to look like? What sort of services do you have, and how do they split up the jobs? What is their concept of operations? So a service mission is something like, the United States Navy is responsible for for the maritime environment, and so it handles all the maritime missions. The ConOps might be about like how it goes about doing that. How does it fight the war? How does it go about doing stuff? Fleet posture is, am I forward deployed or am I not? Then you start designing your fleet. What capabilities do you need in the fleet? How big does it need to be? What type of ships do you need it to be? Where do you put the ships? What's the laydown look like? How many ports do you have, and where do you put it? Right? That gets into the shore infrastructure and the force size. What sort of shore infrastructure do you have? What's your manning strategy? Do you man all the ships all the time? Or do you stay in garrison and only have a cadre? The Brits did that a lot pre-World War I. They had ships that didn't have full crews. The idea being that they'd see the war coming and they'd man the ships fully. So they had a policy that they always wanted to have at least 10% of the crew. But, you could do that with an entire Navy, at least in theory. You could have only 10% of the crew, and you could man it with reservists. That's kind of what the Israelis did with their army for a long time. And I guess in theory still do. But, I mean, that was a big issue in the Yom Kippur War. is that the Egyptians in particular kept going on alert. They kept making threatening moves toward the Israeli border. And every time they did that, the Israelis would have to go on alert. And all the folks would leave their day jobs and go to their reserve billets. And that's great because it meant they had the manpower of the entire state of Israel. But every time they did that, they shut the government down, they shut the economy down, and it was costing them a metric shit ton of money. And the Egyptians just kept turning it on and off and on and off and on and off. And so if your manning strategy is that you're relying on reservists, then that's an issue that they can poke you at. What are your organic support functions? What does the fleet do for itself? What does it offload to other people? What does it do with the shore establishment? What does it do with the fleet at sea? There's a lot of things administratively that the fleet at sea for the U.S. Navy nowadays calls home and says, hey, you do this instead of me, and then tell me what the answer is. So like weather, for instance, right? You've got weather guessers on board the ship, but most of the METOC, meteorology and oceanography, most of the METOC is done ashore and sent out to the ship because that's where the big computers are and the weather specialists are, et cetera, et cetera. And so the same thing with intelligence. The stuff that happens on the ship is mostly people that know how to stimulate the system and get the information they need on the ship and then present it in such a way that it can be turned into operational plans. They don't write the intelligence analysis themselves. They don't do the weather analysis themselves. They do some of the weather analysis themselves, but more than that, they're pulling from satellite networks and analytical networks, et cetera, and then they're sort of like customizing it for local use. Would be the right way to think of that. Then you've got all the force management stuff. What are your personnel policies? What's your logistics concept? What's your level of afloat readiness? Like, are the ships ready to go to sea immediately? Are they at sea? Are they in garrison? What about your shore readiness? Is your shore establishment ready to fight the war? And then how do you buy shit? So for each one of those, there's some assumptions that you have to make, right? You have to, when you answer those questions, those are de facto assumptions that go into all the rest of what you're trying to do in this. And so if you've got, some of this is just resource matching stuff, right? If you've got a small country, Liechtenstein is a bad example because it's landlocked. Who's not landlocked? The Solomons. The Solomons are not going to deploy 10 carrier battle groups. They're just not. They're not going to deploy one carrier battle group. I don't know if they even have a navy. I think if I remember correctly, they basically offload that to other people. And so in that situation, it's, there'd be a mismatch if they had a big navy. That has to be right-sized, and there's some assumptions that go into that. Yeah. One Horsey says, how do they go to Bajor? Do they take the long way around the Federation to get there? That actually highlights another thing that just drives me nuts, is that there are no canonical maps. There's a couple of different maps out there. None of them are really canonical, and they're all two-dimensional. And I'm okay with playing a tactical game in 2 dimensions because I don't think that matters. But when you start trying to do the strategic analysis of what exactly, how the various powers in the Alpha Quadrant all fit together, you really kind of need to have something that's more 3-dimensional, because there's places where you sort of look at it and you go, okay, I get why they're paranoid. They're kind of hemmed in. Yeah, except there's no up or down, right? And so are they side by side like this, or is it like this? Those are 2 dramatically different answers, and they lead to different ways that you can expand, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, there just isn't a good one there. Okay. All right, so I'm going to talk about history, hiding, and hydrodynamics for a little bit here, and try to, like I said, sort of talk about some of the assumptions that are built into it. So for most of history, there were only 2 general types of warship, either the line of battleships or scouts and auxiliaries. And And that's because for most of history, the line of battleships were the ones that went off and fought the war, right? They fought the fleet actions, and scouts and auxiliaries did other things. They might carry the mail, they might bring food, communications, that sort of thing. They did scouting. That's what a scout does. It does scouting. But it wasn't about standing in the line of battle. And so, like at the Battle of Trafalgar, if there were whatever frigates were there were not in the line of battle, because putting them in the line of battle actually made your line weaker, not stronger. Even with the extra guns, it made it weaker, not stronger, because that ship is likely to get pounded to hell, and it's a weak spot in the line. That sort of fundamentally changed in the 20th century. You had new platforms with ship-killing weapons that led to the creation of fighting escorts. So ship-killing weapons is the important part there. That's a really important part. It used to be that if you wanted to sink like a line of battle, like a 74-gun ship, you had to pound at it for a while. Every now and then there's the golden BB that somehow sets a fire that sets off the magazine, but that's rare. That's really rare. That didn't happen very often. Much, much more likely is they pounded each other into scrap. They pounded each other into firewood. Okay, so when you add first torpedoes and then at least later aerial bombs, you've got a situation where a small number of weapons could potentially bring down the biggest ships. And that led to the creation of escorts designed to use those weapons and to protect the big boys from those weapons. Now, as Jellicoe said, it wasn't so much about the ships threatening them, because they could always take actions in order to reduce the threat. They could turn away, they could fire on the torpedo boats or whatever it was. They could do stuff. But if they're doing that stuff, they're not concentrating on the enemy line of battle, the enemy battle line. And so they really want to be concentrating on the enemy battle line, because that's what they're there to do, is to sink the enemy battle line. And so it's easier to have escorts go off and do that sort of stuff. You also have a situation where you went from everything with surface combat to now I have to worry about submarines, now I have to worry about airplanes, and that sort of led to a level of specialization you didn't have before. And so specialized missions required specialized ships. And then you also had naval treaties, like the London and Washington naval treaties, that got into the mix and caused weird shit to happen. So, and when you add all this stuff up, it's also important to remember that battleship, for instance, can mean both the ship on the bottom, which was the USS Wisconsin, and the ship on the top, which was the USS Oklahoma. Now, the Oklahoma, I think by that point, clearly the Oklahoma has been stripped. She's not being used as a battleship anymore. But, you can see how big she was compared to how big the Wisconsin was. And there's no reason to think that those two ships in their prime were the equivalent. And they weren't. Wisconsin had better armor, bigger guns, or at least the same size guns and more of them, and could travel a lot faster and had much better fire control, including things like radar. So they weren't equals, but they were both called battleships. So sometimes the name in and of itself doesn't tell you everything you need. Okay, hiding is important. Ships can hide in 4 different ways. They can hide behind the curve of the Earth. They can hide behind what I call the interface barrier, which is the sea surface, right? If you're above the sea surface, you have one set of sensors. If you're below the sea surface, you have other set of sensors, and sensors don't penetrate that interface barrier very easily. You can hide through the use of distance and space, and you can hide through the use of low observable features. Okay, so what are the assumptions built into here? So if I'm using the curve of the Earth terrestrially to hide, if I go out into space, I don't have the curve of the Earth. I've got long lines of sight. That translates into the mission of ships, right? On Earth, when the enemy could be hiding behind the curve of the Earth, I need to go find them. I need to scout. This is especially true if you go back to the days where your primary sensors mark one eyeball. But even with radar Radar, certain types of radar in certain conditions will bend around the curve of the Earth, and there's other things you can do. Radar really matters what the frequency is, but by and large, radar also is a line of sight sensor, just like eyes, more or less. And so you can hide behind the curve of the Earth from a radar. Well, okay, so if you're out in space, that obviously isn't the case. How far can I see? Am I using active sensors? And if so, what are they? Cruisers were widely considered to be the eyes of the fleet because they were relatively fast ships that you could send out to deal with stuff, to go look for things. They were also useful because they were basically the largest ship that you'd be willing to risk on a routine basis, right? If you didn't want to send your battleships into danger, you sent your cruisers instead. That's why they fought a lot of night actions in the Pacific. But they were always sort of considered to be the eyes of the fleet. And that's why that determined how they were built, right? It determined the fact that you wanted your cruisers to have high speed. Slow cruisers weren't particularly useful. There was a time period where you had armored cruisers and protected cruisers and stuff like that, and things slowed down. And that time period's kind of a mess. At some point I'm going to go through and do a series of shows on the different types of ships, and I can tell you right now that the show on cruisers is probably going to be more than one episode, because by the time you do protected cruisers, unprotected cruisers, armored cruisers, battle cruisers, heavy cruisers, and light cruisers, scout cruisers too. By the time you do all that stuff, and everything I just mentioned is over the course of like 100 years, right? By the time you sort of sort through all that stuff, it's going to be a couple of shows. So in any event, you got cruisers as the eyes of the fleet. Well, if I don't have the curve of the Earth, does my fleet need separate eyes? Or can I just see it? Right? If I've got an infinite line of sight, can I spot the thing coming at me? That depends a lot about your other assumptions, right? If I've got a tactically useful FTL drive and a tactically useful jump drive where I can just sort of appear, okay, I don't have infinite long lines of sight, but because something can just sort of show up. But then again, does a scout cruiser help with that situation? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, depending upon some of the other particulars. But, my favorite examples of that, one of which is the Exordium series, which I want to do a read along at some point. In the Exordium series, you've basically got battle cruisers and you've got destroyers. You've also got you also have frigates, but frigates generally, when the big boys are playing, the frigates stay out of the way. And you've got corvettes, which are a carried craft, and they fulfill a scouting role. And they do have scouting in that universe, in that you jump all over the place, and you've got tactical transponders that you leave in place, and you send your ships around to ping the tactical transponders, because you're basically trying to figure out the activities of life of these ships, right? You're trying to figure out where they're jumping around and where they're going to, et cetera, so that and then you do predictive models to figure out where they're going to go. There's a lot of hand waving in there, but it's basically gun kata with starships. But in that universe, you only have a couple of ship types, and cruisers really isn't one of them. The battle cruisers look more like battleships. My old friend Arius Kaufman, may he rest in peace, and I, when we designed the game in this universe, we kind of proposed to the authors of it that our belief is that there used to be something called a cruiser, and they died out. And the reason why cruisers died out is that battle cruisers were so much better at being cruisers than cruisers were, and the cruisers didn't have an independent role. You didn't really need them. Destroyers in that universe, incidentally, are not escorts. Destroyers are more patrol vessels, and they're designed to operate in packs. They operate in a squadron of 3. And they've got a BFG, and 3 destroyers, if handled well, can take down a battle cruiser. So your geography really affects all this. Navies are designed to operate in this geography with the particular media of the air and the water. If I don't have that media, and I don't have that geography, do my fleets look the same? And the answer is they probably don't, because I'm operating under a dramatically different set of assumptions, a dramatically different context. Stealth in space is highly, highly assumptions dependent, more so than I think anything else. I mean, there's a school of thought that says that there is no stealth in space, but that school of thought is predicated upon a long, 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 long list of assumptions. That includes the nature of the jump drive, the nature of the drive, right? Can he just show up on top of me or not? What the time to detect is, how much time you have available. That's, the jump drive thing. What the environment looks like. How stealthy can you be, right? Can you absorb radar? Can you generally hide infrared? I'm not talking about absolutes, right? If I've got 3 weeks to look for you, I'm going to find you, probably. But it's important to remember that the people that argue stealth in space is automatically a thing. In the real world, sensors have noise. In the real world, sensors have to have things like be cooled, right? In the real world, you have to make assumptions about what the background environment looks like. The background environment in space is not uniform because you've got dust and other stuff in the system that is heated by the sun. You've got outgassing from planets. You've got solar flux, lots of different, particle types, et cetera, et cetera. The cosmic microwave background is not uniform. And so you might end up, based upon your assumptions, end up with a situation where, yeah, you can find somebody if you have enough time. But how much time is enough? If I have to jump in around Neptune and just sort of slog in, especially if I've got a magic fusion torch, or if my drive system lights up the sky, then maybe I can see you, because I can figure out what the background looks like, and I can compare, if we do change analysis, et cetera, and I'm seeing an extra 5 degrees centigrade there, and so that must be where they are. That must be, and it seems to be moving, so that's it. Well, there's an awful lot of ifs there, right? Depends upon your sensors, depending upon, what sort of angles you've got on everything. Am I staring into the sun or not? Is the sun in my field of view? That can change things. And how much time do I have to do that? And, it's also kind of making the assumption that I understand the environment I'm in, that I'm in this system, right? Maybe I'm not in this system. Maybe I just got here myself, and I'm trying to find you who maybe have been in the system for a while. I don't know what the background looks like here. I have to analyze the background first before I know what the changes in the background will look like. So theoretically, there's no stealth in space. The details matter, because if you use the same set of assumptions that the no stealth in space crowd uses to conclude that there's no stealth in space, there's also no stealth airplanes or submarines. Those sets of assumptions, every assumption about space in some way, shape, or form, is also true about both the undersea environment and the air environment. The no stealth in space crowd doesn't fully appreciate the fact that it's really about signal to noise ratios, right? I will always tell people, you want to find the stealth airplane? Give me control of your radar, and I'll find the stealth airplane for you. I can detect the stealth airplane. I'll just go and grab the gain knob and crank it all the way up to the right. Turn it all the way to 11. At which point I'll say, the stealth airplane is one of the 10,000 dots that just appeared on the screen. You just have to figure out which dot it is, but it's there. It's there. So in theory and practice are the same. In practice, not so much. Okay, hydrodynamics. This is about performance of ships, not about stealth. In the real world, long ships are faster. and that's because of the way fluid dynamics work. Just the longer the ship is on a per ton basis, proportionally, your propulsion problem gets easier. Propulsive power increases as the cube of the speed. So longer ships are faster, but the faster the ship goes, the harder it is to go even faster. And so this is basically why ships have top speeds, because drag goes up as the ship goes faster. But it's also why an aircraft carrier is faster than a destroyer, especially over long distances, but frequently over short distances too, because aircraft carriers are big ships with big engines. And there's this quote here from O'Connell: "The implications were nothing less than enormous for ships that would eventually be capable of 25 knots. For example, HMS Princess Royal would need 27,000 extra knots, which is 70,000 or 27,000 more horsepower, which is than the indefatigable, to travel 1 knot faster. So it's not quite doubling it. It's it's like between like what? That's about a 75% increase in horsepower to go 1 knot faster. Now, I should say something about O'Connell. Don't buy this book. It's crap. O'Connell doesn't understand battleships at all. The subtitle of this book is it's Sacred Vessels, the American Navy and the Cult of the Battleship, or something like that. The book is garbage. It's garbage. But he's got a couple of interesting quotes here. But literally, this is the only part of this book that's worth reading. Okay, so when you sort of combine the history and hydrodynamics portion of this, you end up with sort of a little bit of the history of how ships work here. In World War I, you have to trade off between speed and armor and guns, so you optimized. By World War II, you got to the point where the ship wasn't going to go any faster because your engines had reached the hull limit. So because drag was going up and speed was going up increasingly slow, you got to the point where your ship was doing as fast as it was going to get. But so you might as well put that extra displacement, allocate that towards guns and armor. And so early on, you had to really choose: do I want a fast ship? Assuming I want big guns, lots of firepower. Do I want a fast ship or do I want a well-armored ship? And you had to kind of decide. And so we ended up with dreadnought battleships and dreadnought battle cruisers. By the time World War II happened, those two design paths had come back together because the propulsion had gotten as good as it was going to get. And so you kind of brought them back together. That doesn't mean that you could intentionally sub-optimize on one of them. Sub-optimize is the wrong word. Sub-maximize, right? Right? The Montana class was going to be slower because they decided to trade off to get more armor and more guns to just make it slower. The important part here is they really couldn't have made it faster. It would have been really hard to make it much faster. So, let's see. I'm trying to think. There was something else I was going to say about this in particular. All of this is dependent, of course, like rockets don't work like that until you get going really, really fast. Your top speed in a rocket, in anything that looks like, and by rocket, I mean you throw mass out the back to go faster. So in this case, an ion drive, for purposes of this discussion, an ion drive is as much a rocket as a Saturn V F1 engine is. Your top speed is determined by the speed of your exhaust. You get to the point where you just can't. Acceleration gets slower and slower over time. So from that standpoint, maybe kind of, but has more to do with the propulsion mechanism than the size. You could be very, very small with a very, very big ion thruster, and you still have the same limitations as you would be with a big ship and a small ion thruster, it would take you longer to get there. So, okay. Well, so let's talk a little bit about doing it right and wrong. A few thoughts on, okay, so let's just assume that you're all writing your science fiction novels and you want there to be navies in them, and you've come to me and you've said, hey, Chris, what's your recommendation on this? The first thing I would say is inspiration is better than, and you can see I didn't finish this thought because I was trying to think of the right word for this. Inspiration is better than slavishly replicating something else. Inspiration is better than plagiarism. Inspiration is better than replication, etc. So use a historical example to point you in a particular direction, but you still have to write all the assumptions down and think about how this all fits together. Because just taking like World War II and putting it in space frequently will end up with problems, because at some point you go, but that doesn't make any sense because that's based upon a real world thing that isn't true for space. So why do it that way? Now, there's a fantastic exception to that. You can do this, it's just hard. And sometimes doing it comes off feeling unsatisfactory. And it feels unsatisfactory because it looks like all you're trying to do is do World War II in space. Glenn Cook's Passage at Arms is clearly Glenn Cook trying to do World War II in space, but it does not feel unsatisfactory, at least not to me. It's basically Das Boot in space. He's managed to come up with something that is analogous to a submarine, works just like a submarine. They use it like submarines, has some of the same restrictions as submarines, but it really works in his context. He sat down and he seriously thought it through. And for any given thing, you can sort of look at it and say, like, why does it work that way? And he's told you why it works that way, right? He's told you why it's different. And it's a combination of an effect that they've discovered where basically you can sort of phase into a parallel dimension. Not the hyperspace that they use to move forward. It's in the other direction. So you can sort of think of hyperspace as down and this is up. They call them climbers. They're climbing up into instead of sinking, they climb. And it leaves only a pinpoint size element where you're in real space, but that's where you have to radiate all your heat through. And so you can only climb for a certain amount of time because you'll roast yourself. And they also have the restriction that because climbing causes fusion reactors to fail, the process of fusion does not work in that other universe, they have to use antimatter, which only insane people would use antimatter as a power source. Insane or desperate people, and these people are desperate to power these nifty submarine-like things that they're going to use to, like submarines. And so they end up using antimatter to do it, and antimatter has all sorts of restrictions, starting with the fact that they can only carry so much of it without it being a total danger, and so they're limited on how much they can do. It is a fantastic book. I've been known to buy extra copies and give them to people. So you should all go buy it. It's available on Amazon in both Kindle, and I think it's still available in Dead Tree Edition. It's a fantastic book. Now, how about some wrong ways to do it? One wrong way to do it is Star Wars. So I don't analyze Star Wars because that way madness lies. But I do remember watching the last Star Wars. I think it was the last one. Watching the last movie, and we saw what were clearly bombers doing bombing runs, dropping bombs that for some strange reason in space just fell down because they were bombers. And bombers drop bombs and bombs fall down because bombers. It's really kind of silly. Star Wars is so explicitly World War II in space that Lucas in the original famously watched World War II footage and like replicated it shot by shot. Okay, all right, that's great. A worse example in my mind, because there's less reason why it should be this way, is Stephen Donaldson's Gap series. I mentioned a couple of times earlier that I was going to come back to Borders, so this is the place where I come back to Borders. The Gap series has a lot of different problems. You've got the problem of a jump drive that occasionally causes psychotic episodes with people, and yet the equivalent of the Naval/Merchant Marine Academy apparently does not test people for the psychosis caused by the jump drive. They don't take people on familiarization tours. The person who had the psychotic episode when she jumped the first time, it was her very first jump. She was a graduate and had never jumped before. Okay, tell me how that works. Tell me how she got to the system where the school was. She had never been in a jump before. None of that made sense. But the biggest problem in my mind was the border issue, because they had this jump drive that they explicitly say that if you've got the coordinates, you can essentially go to anywhere in explored space in one jump. You also find that out in the first book. You also find out in the first book that Earth is at war. There have been incidents. It's not like full off fleet action, but it's like there's a hostile alien power and they're getting ready to go down. And you find out that that the Earth fleet has all been deployed to the borders to protect Earth territory. So you find out that the Earth fleet has been deployed to the borders in the same book where you find out that there are no borders. There's no such thing as a border in this universe because I can go directly to wherever. Right? Jump drives have a tendency to do that. Unless something about your jump drive adds geography. So like Alderson points, or Alderson points, you also see them in Michael McCollum's Antari series and in the game Starfire, this idea that I have to go to a particular place to activate my jump drive to go. Or it might just simply be my jump drive can go to any place I can get to, but my range is such, this is how Traveler does it, my range is such that I can only go to certain places. And so I have to follow a route to get from point A to point B. I have to go to all these. I'm going from A to D. I have to go to B and C to get to D because I can't go directly to one. Okay, in those situations, you can have borders and you can interdict with a jump drive. But if I can go from any place to any place, there are no borders, right? Now, there's a fascinating book that I always recommend to people that if you want to understand how borders work, you need to read this book. You need to go back and reread the first edition to see if there's been changes between the first and second edition. But the second edition is in print. And that is Edward Luttwak's The Grand Strategy of the Roman Empire, because he talks about how the Romans handle borders. Now, those of you who are Roman history fans, will remember the crisis of the 3rd century. Rome had territorial integrity. She had borders. In fact, during a large part of the empire, of the Republic and then the empire, she deployed her legions on the borders. And the legions basically, they didn't so much protect the borders as they used the borders to jump off of, right? Legions would campaign outside the borders of the empire. They didn't wait for the bad shit to come to the empire. If they heard about there's a tribe massing, they went to them and whacked them. But during the crisis of the 3rd century, they were under pressure from a lot of different barbarians in a lot of different ways. They were having some manpower issues. They were having some issues with their borders. And you started seeing cities rebuilding their walls. They didn't need walls before because they had borders. And so like the walls of Rome had come down because it had been 200 years since they had needed to have borders, right? The last time cities needed to have borders were during the Civil War. And before that, you know, if you go back to the Punic Wars, right, Rome was glad that she had walls. By the time 200 AD rolls around, she doesn't need walls anymore because nobody can get anywhere near her. But, you know, then you started having this situation at the crisis of the 3rd century, and the borders ended up being a lot more permeable than they were before, and cities started building walls again. So what were the purpose of those walls? The idea of the wall is not that you're just going to sit it out automatically. The idea, the wall gives you, if you've got raiders who have come across the border, the closer you were to the frontier, the more that you had to worry about this. If you've got raiders that are coming across the border, the idea is that the wall holds long enough for the military forces to get there, for word to get out to a legion and a legion to come and wail on those folks. So from that standpoint, that's how the borders worked in the Roman Empire. It's not how, that's how in the Gap series, there are no borders, but they use borders, right? And when he said that, when that comes up, that they previously had talked about the jump drive, and then there was the comment, and everybody knows that, right? That wasn't a surprise. And then when he says something about the fleet being deployed on the borders, I said, in book 3, the bad guys are going to jump directly to Earth. And that's exactly what happened. At the end of book 3, the bad guys jumped directly to Earth. And now you've got this crisis because there's no naval forces there because the bad guys have all jumped directly to Earth. Yeah, don't do that. So this is not the last word on this topic. I will come back to this at some point in the future. Not exactly sure when. Let me do a quick sweep through the questions and see what's going on here. One Horse Shay said something about like the Wing Commander series. Yes, the Wing Commander. I will admit I haven't played the games, and I've seen the movie, and I actually count the movie as a guilty pleasure. But yeah, it's like, you know, there are places you have to go to get from point A to point B. The movie has an awful lot of stuff wrong with it. The entire, you know, the movie is actually a really good example of the wrong way to do it, right? In that they even talk about the climb rates in space of the Kilrathi fighters. You know, about trying to go vertical, and the Kilrathi can go vertical better than you can. It's in space. There is no vertical. There's lots of things that are wrong with that. Now, what I would argue is not wrong with that movie is that it's a very good big picture strategic plot, right? The bad guys have figured out where our home planet is. We do not have a blocking force in position to block them, or it may very well be that the blocking force was destroyed when they took the Navcom AI. And so the only force that's available to function as both a blocking force and a reconnaissance force is thrown into their way to function as a speed bump. I only need 24 hours from you. You need to slow them down for 24 hours. And in the process of doing that job, they're able to turn the tables. I think that should have been a fantastic movie, and I would love for them to remake it. One Horse Shay says it's a guilty pleasure movie, and it still has the old tech manual they published when the movie came out. I didn't know there was a tech manual. At least I don't. Oh, you know what? Maybe I do. I may have that in the 149 boxes of books that are in the storage unit. I need to double check that. But let me see what else we got here. Eric Henry points out that if you broadcasting at the same power and wavelength, then you would appear as a black spot against a noisy background. Once again, easier said than done. Maybe that is the case. Maybe your sensors have the resolution. Maybe your sensors don't have enough internal noise. Maybe you can figure that out. Maybe you have time to figure that out. The assumptions are really important here, right? And like I said, this all boils down to according by the logic of the no stealth in space people, there are no such thing as stealthy submarines or no such thing as stealthy aircraft, because it's the same sort of assumptions about how the environment works and what I can see. And in all those cases, the environment is more complex than sort of the simple, I'll just spot you against the background. I think most of the rest of the comments I've actually already addressed. So with that in mind, I think I'm going to go ahead and call it for this evening. So thank you very much. I should be doing this next week, although I think I'm going to be doing it from my brother's place. And I don't know if I'm going to have anybody else with me, but I will certainly be there. And with that in mind, I will say thank you very much, everybody. I appreciate the fact that you're willing to spend your Saturday night here with me. This started off as just a COVID project, but I'm glad I'm still doing it, and I intend to keep on doing it. And so until next time, live long and prosper, everybody.